Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Mike Pence is in the very first presidential contest state of Iowa tonight in the midst of a three-day campaign swing there. And while there is nothing more predictable than a former vice president making his own run for the White House, Mike Pence is, of course, in a rather unique position. Not only was he number two to the twice impeached, twice indicted ex-president Donald Trump, he is now running against his former boss for the Republican nomination. I have to say, Mike Pence has always struck me as a somewhat ridiculous figure. He always sounds like he's doing a bad impersonation of a politician. But his biggest obstacle in the Republican primary is that the voters do not seem to like him very much. Despite his real advantage on name recognition, just 7% of Republican primary voters say they would vote for Pence if the primary election were held today. And this is even more damning for him. 37% have a negative opinion of the former vice president, compared to 33% of primary voters who view him positively, according to that same NBC News poll. That's what we call in the business underwater on favorabilities. There's a very clear reason for that. Donald Trump, the still quite popular frontrunner for the Republican nomination, blames Mike Pence. On January 6th, and over and over and over again in the 2.5 years since then, Trump has told his followers that it was Mike Pence's fault that Trump wasn't able to pull off his coup. The morning of the insurrection, in front of an angry crowd gathered at the Stop the Steal rally, Trump made one last appeal to Pence that sounded more like a threat.
Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now.
Egged on by the president, a violent mob hell-bent on finding Pence then marched to the Capitol, as we know. They broke in and they ransacked the building, roaming the halls and chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." Someone even erected a gallows with a noose outside of the building. As the danger became apparent and imminent, the Secret Service evacuated the vice president from the Senate chamber, where he was presiding over the election certification proceedings. They eventually moved Pence to an underground parking garage beneath the Capitol, where he learned that Donald Trump was attacking him on Twitter.
He was in this concrete, parking garage, and with his family, and this is the vice president of the United States, and he's holed up in a basement. His chief of staff, Mark Short, showing him his phone, and it's the tweet of Trump saying Mike Pence didn't have the courage. This is the guy who fled the rioters, and Trump is saying he didn't have the courage, and you can see it kind of looks like Pence is grimacing, but you can never really tell.
Donald Trump quite clearly and almost explicitly painted a target on his vice president's back on January 6th, when he had every reason to know that he was in physical danger. Trump left Pence alone to decide what to do on his own, with a mob invading the Capitol. Where to go? Left him furtively making phone calls like this one to Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Hi, Mr. Vice President? Hi. Yeah, we're okay. We're here with Mr. Schumer, Mr. McConnell, the leadership, House and Senate. And how are you? Oh, my goodness, where are you? God bless you. I worry about you being in that Capitol, though. Don't let anybody know where you are.
Keep in mind, at this point, the leadership, Pelosi, had been evacuated out of that building. So when she says, I'm worried about you being in that Capitol, she's saying you are physically trapped in a building that is being overrun with people that want your death. Donald Trump sicked the mob on his own vice president. He left him to the wolves, and he still blames Mike Pence for not doing his bidding that day. And so even now, a big contingent of diehard Trump supporters think that Mike Pence is a traitor, even though he's the opposite in the sense that he actually fulfilled his constitutional duty on January 6th. And the Republican voters who want to move past Donald Trump, well, they don't like the fact that Pence was a toady on pretty much every other day of his entire term. And that leaves Pence pretty much stuck with just 7% support. But ambition makes people do amazing things, doesn't it? Crisscrossing the state of Iowa, trying to convince people the mob calling for your death had it all wrong. And that's really the task the former vice president set for himself yesterday in Sioux City, Iowa. It's a small campaign event, sort of typical thing at a pizza ranch, a meet and greet with the county Republican Party. And to be clear, and this is important, This was a room full of rank-and-file Iowa Republican caucus goers who came to see and speak to Pence. It was not some rowdy MAGA crowd at a Trump rally. But as you will hear in this clip, one voter did ask about his role on January 6th, as Donald Trump would describe it. And based on the reaction in the room as Pence answered, the crowd sure seemed pretty skeptical of the broadly true story Pence told.
If it wasn't for your vote, we would not have Joe Biden in the White House.
Right.
Joe Biden shouldn't be there. And all those wonderful things that you and Trump were doing together would be continuing, and this country would be on the right path. Do you ever second guess yourself? That was a constitutional right that you had to send those votes back to the states. It was not like you were going to personally elect him. We all know by the number of votes that were there who won that election.
Well,
You changed history for this country.
Yeah, let me speak to the issue, because I think it's an issue that continues to be misunderstood. But I know by God's grace I did exactly what the Constitution of the United States required of me that day. I kept my oath. But let me be very respectful of the question and tell you, look, states conduct our elections. You never want to let Washington, D.C. run elections. You certainly would never want one person in Washington, D.C. to decide who the President of the United States is.
You weren't deciding. You were just sending it back to the states.
Ma'am, let me explain it to you. States conduct elections. Iowa, where I live in Indiana. And after there were questions in a half a dozen or so states, we had reviews of the results, 60 different lawsuits that went to the courts. Where there are questions, there's two ways that they're reviewed. Number one is you take those issues to the legal process in the state for recount. Okay? Secondly, you take them to the courts, which we did very aggressively. Now, there were voting irregularities that took place. You had a half a dozen states that changed the rules in the name of COVID, but the courts upheld those changes in virtually every instance, and in every instance where they would have had any impact whatsoever. At the end of the day, when Iowa certified your results and sent them to Washington, D.C., when Indiana certified our results, the Constitution of the United States in Article 2 says the job of the Vice President is to serve as the presiding officer of a joint session where you open and count the votes. Don't take my word for it. Go read the Constitution. Not really. I say this with great affection and respect. The Constitution is very clear. My job was to oversee a session of Congress where objections could be heard, and I made sure that objections would be recognized. So we would hear whatever evidence or whatever debate there was, but the Constitution says you open and count the votes, no more, no less. The Constitution affords no authority for the Vice President or anyone else to reject votes or return votes to the states. Never been done before, should never be done in the future. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's actually what the Constitution says. No Vice President in American history ever asserted the authority that you have been convinced that I had. And I want to tell you, with all due respect, I said when I announced, President Trump was wrong about my authority that day, and he's still wrong. I believe it with all my heart.
I mean, it's not a huge bit of applause, not a rising crescendo. There's some claps. Imagine having to do that at every campaign stop. It's a remarkable clip. I mean, for a whole bunch of reasons, but just to name a few. First of all, what stands out, again, I never thought Mike Pence was a particularly impressive politician, but after so many years following Donald Trump, it is just surprising, almost bracing, to just hear a politician attempt to persuade people with a series of sequential arguments by drawing on facts, making a kind of persuasive point. Still, though, it does not feel like that crowd was all that receptive. The woman who asked Mike Pence that question later told a reporter she believes Pence is a good man, but his decision to not reject the Electoral College votes makes it difficult for her to back him in the upcoming primary. Quote, I really do feel like he altered history. And that event and that exchange that we just saw is such a clear illustration of not only Mike Pence's problem, but our collective political problem right now. I mean, here he is in a room with a selection of interested Republican caucus goers in Iowa, people who make up the base of one of the two major parties and coalitions. And he cannot get them to buy his explanation for why undoing the entire American constitutional order was not the right thing to do. I mean, think of that small room and that man having that interaction, and watching him try to do it is like watching someone try to drain the ocean with a teacup. How many iterations of that spiel would Mike Pence have to have, face by face, voter after voter, to convince Republican voters of the basic, inescapable truth? And it really makes you wonder why Pence is even trying at all. I mean, again, like I said, ambition makes people do crazy things. But I will also say you have to remember that Mike Pence knows the actual facts of what happened on January 6th better than almost anyone. He had conversations with Donald Trump that day that no one else had. He has also cooperated with special counsel Jack Smith's investigation, testifying before the federal grand jury earlier this year. So he probably has a good sense about where that case is going and what it may look like. And maybe Mike Pence is making a bet. His electoral chances may not look very good right now, and he may not be able to go convince every last Republican one by one he did the right thing on January 6th. But maybe, who knows, some further developments, like an actual criminal case, could change the outlook.
For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want, and you never need to pick up a camera or use any fancy editing software. With Doodly,
it was just 1 month ago that Donald Trump was indicted on 37 counts related to his handling of classified materials. Trump's Mar-a-Lago judge, Aileen Cannon, set the trial date for August 14th, and everyone sort of knew that that is not going to hold. It's almost certainly going to change in the coming weeks. Then special counsel Jack Smith's office filed to hold the trial as early as December, and we've yet to see how long Trump and his lawyers plan to drag out the process, but what they'll come back with. But a new poll from Political Magazine and Ipsos is giving us some fascinating insight into how voters are thinking about this. It found that a clear majority of Americans, 62%, think the trial should happen before the 2024 election. Take a look at when we break that out by political affiliation. You see that red column on the left side, that's of your screen. Almost half of Republicans, in fact, a plurality of them, agree the trial should happen quickly. Only a little more than a third disagree. Over on the right side on your screen, roughly the same number of independents think the trial should happen before the election. And when asked about Trump's guilt, almost half of all Americans said they believe he is guilty of the charges. Less than a third do not think he's guilty. And again, breaking that down by party gives us a pretty interesting picture. Unsurprisingly, an overwhelming majority of Democrats believe he's guilty. But again, look at that red column. A full quarter of Republicans think Trump is guilty, which is interesting. There's the very people he needs to win over to get the nomination. Another 20% are unsure. And look how many people, independents, just don't know. That's the yellow column, right? It's not a good sign for the ex-president. More than a third of independents think he's guilty. A little less than half are just unsure, and they could go either way. Ankush Karduri is a former federal prosecutor. He is now a contributing writer for Political Magazine, where he wrote about this new polling, and he joins me now. Ankush, I thought the logic of, I was surprised by the finding that 62% say, yes, let's have this trial before the election. What do you think of it?
I was surprised by it too, and in particular, the fact that almost half of Republicans held that view, as you noted. And what I draw from that is that, Americans are taking this seriously, and they want to know the outcome of this proceeding before they potentially head to the polls and reelect this man. And, I have to say that, the fact that people want this to move along quickly is somewhat surprising to me, because it may be hard for the judge to accommodate that preference. But it kind of, I thought, was somewhat reassuring that people are taking this seriously and thinking to themselves, well, this is information that I would like to have before I consider whether or not this man should be in office again.
Yes, I mean, it's the most obviously logical way to think about this. Like, okay, let's have a trial and see, did he do this thing? Let's give him the process and have it out and have a conclusion about if the man's, a felon or not before we decide to vote for him. I also thought, one thing I thought too was, and people have said this all along, if you're a Republican who thinks he's being railroaded and he's innocent, you want his name cleared as soon as possible, right? I mean, if you think the guy didn't do it, and if you think that's all going to come out of trial, there's an incentive to have it so that you can say, I don't want this hanging over me when voters go to the polls.
Yeah, that's true, right? So there is an argument in favor of, if you're that sort of voter, you hold that view, that you would want this to happen before the election, so it'll clear his name. But I think that, there were other numbers in the poll that suggest some sort of complications around the narrative that these indictments may actually be helping Trump. I think these numbers don't actually back that up, and they suggest to me, in fact, that the Republican respondents were a little bit more conflicted. I mean, if you ran the numbers, it was basically a net nothing in terms of the effect that the indictment had on Republicans' views. Roughly a quarter, I think, said it made them more likely. Roughly a quarter said less likely to support him, and about a half said that they don't know. And, I know that Trump and many of his allies have been saying, oh, these indictments are like, propelling him through the polls and boosting the fundraising numbers. But as you know, correlation is not causation, and a lot of other things have happened during the same period. And I think these numbers suggest that it may not be the indictments that are affecting the trajectory of the GOP primary race at the moment.
Nearly every state in the country gives its governor some form of a line item veto power, where they effectively get to take a red editor's pen to bills, crossing out certain aspects they don't like, and then sign the rest of the bill into law. Notably, that authority is not granted to the President of the United States. The Supreme Court struck down a federal line item veto back in 1998. Despite Bill Clinton being president at the time, the federal line item veto is actually the brainchild of House Republicans, who saw it as a useful tool to rein in federal spending. During his successful campaign for governor, Wisconsin Republican Scott Walker effectively said as much the same.
I have a line item veto just as powerful as the governor. As the county executive. That's one of the few things that county executives have that are different than anybody else. I use that, simple to me, economics 101, government 101 is you use the line item veto to eliminate or lower the cost of something in the budget.
Right? You use the line item veto to eliminate or lower the cost of something in the budget. Well, in the last few days, two Democratic governors dealing with hostile Republican legislatures have managed to use the line item veto to score some pretty amazing political victories. So in Wisconsin, Democratic Governor Tony Evers is facing one of the most aggressively gerrymandered legislatures in the country. So Governor Evers had to get clever in order to fight for his priorities. Now, Wisconsin governors used to have an even more expansive line item veto power than they do now. Quote, at one time, governors could veto individual letters to create new words, known as the Vanna White veto, or strike words from two or more sentences to make new sentences, known as the Frankenstein veto. Wisconsin governors cannot strike individual words and letters from bills anymore, probably for the best. There's nothing saying they can't fool around with numbers.
The governor also using his authority to ensure increased funding for public schools for the next 400 years, unless changed by a future legislature and governor. The governor's move increasing each year how much revenue schools can raise.
Yes, that's right. Governor Evers extended school funding in Wisconsin by more than 400 years using the line item veto. You see, the legislature approved a boost in funding through the 2024-25 school year. The governor took his handy veto pen, crossed out the 20 along with a hyphen, changing 2024-25 to 24-25. So additional funding through the year 24-25 will now be the law of the land in Wisconsin until someone comes along to change it. In Pennsylvania, Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro also got creative with his veto power. Shapiro negotiated an expansion of, again, public school funding, but he also had to whip votes for a controversial compromise that would subsidize private schools with voucher programs in order to pass the bill through the Republican-controlled Senate, which it did last week. And before it passed the Democratic House last night, Shapiro announced he's going to use the line item veto on the school voucher program he helped negotiate and got it through the Senate after he used it as bait to get Republicans on board with his budget. All this brings me back to two major points. One, I think the case against the line item veto is pretty strong. I'm still a little unsold. It's the best thing. Going forward, probably find some bipartisan consensus to getting rid of it, or at least, reining it in some ways. But point number two, and this is the most important thing for Evers, Shapiro, when you are elected to office of either party, but in this case of Democrats, you've got to wield the power you have on things you believe in and that you promise to deliver. And in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, we got two pretty good examples of that.